The cold case of a murdered 8-year-old girl was actually just solved here in 2023. It only took 48 years. Hello, true crimerers. This is the case of Gretchen Harrington. Viewer discretion is advised. Real quick before we get started, hello, I'm Mike. If you're new here, I tell true crime stories here on YouTube. I tell 3 stories a week. I also tell short form true crime stories over on the TikTok. The link to that is in the link tree in the description of this video below, as well as my other socials. So please follow wherever you like, all over the place. I would appreciate it. But into today's case. Gretchen Eleanor Harrington was born on June 13th, 1967, and she was actually born in Minnesota. Now, Gretchen was one of 4 total siblings. She had 2 older sisters. Their names were Zoe and Harriet, and literally like a week or 2, or I think before this story happens, their mother gave birth to baby Jessica. Apparently there was like this little joke that Gretchen had. She said to her mom, "If you have another girl, I'm running away from home," because Gretchen really wanted a brother because she already had 2 sisters, and you know. But when Jessica was born, everyone said that Gretchen was just so excited to be, you know, finally be a big sister to someone, and she was just really ready to help out in any way she could. The Harrington family was very much religious. Actually, Gretchen's dad was a reverend. Reverend Harold Harrington was the reverend at the Reformed Presbyterian Covenant, and this was in Marple Township, which is in Philadelphia. Gretchen's mom, Ina, was a stay-at-home mom. Now, because, you know, her dad was a reverend, it's said that the kids grew up in a stricter home than, say, other kids in the neighborhood grew up in. For example, like, they weren't allowed to watch television. When it came time for Sundays, which was, you know, big church day, the kids weren't allowed to go outside and play. But the home environment was always looked at and described as a very loving household. Their, you know, the parents were extremely caring and gave their girls, you know, everything they needed, everything they wanted. And they were a really close family. No one really had anything bad or negative to say about the Harrington household. It was just a well-loved family. Gretchen, at 8 years old, was a very popular girl in school. She had a large group of friends, but she was still described as being a pretty shy kid, especially around people she didn't know, which was a good thing, you know, so that, you know, she didn't really ever want to interact with strangers, people she didn't know. This brings us to the summer of 1975. During the summer, Gretchen would attend Vacation Bible School, which is part of Trinity Chapel. Typically, she would walk there with her 2 older sisters, but on August 15th, 1975, her 2 older sisters would be staying home that day because that was also the same day that their new baby sister was actually coming home from the hospital. Gretchen was actually wanting to stay home that day too, but her dad, you know, being the reverend, said, "You have a perfect attendance here at the Vacation Bible School, and so you don't want to mess with that." And so she would end up going there. Now, this particular occasion, which was unusual because she had never done this, she walked to the school alone. Apparently, the school and the Harrington house, I believe, were on the same road. Gretchen would have to walk up like this kind of almost steep hill, which is what the road was, and then straight to the chapel. She left her home that morning sometime around approximately 9 o'clock. She should have been there within 10, maybe 15 minutes, but she didn't get there. David Zanstra was the reverend there at Trinity Chapel, and I guess he would be leading the morning activities that particular morning. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, their morning activities were done, and so David Zanstra, who was one of the people who would also transport the children to the Presbyterian church, he loaded up, I guess, like half the kids, and then they went their way to the church. By 11 a.m., the Harringtons were made aware that Gretchen hadn't shown up, and so they didn't really get, this is 1975, cell phones, pagers, emails, again, they didn't exist, so you couldn't really get into immediate contact necessarily with people like, hey, where's Gretchen? So they contacted the Harrington household kind of after the morning services were over to say, hey, we haven't seen Gretchen. Did she stay home today? They said no, she left around 9. She should have been there. And so by 11 o'clock in the morning, Harold Harrington basically tells David Zanstra, please call the police and report her missing, and then they're going to go out and they're going to go start looking for her, like Harold was. Once the police were informed, the search began. There was no waiting around. This was an 8-year-old girl, so they began to, police along with volunteers, friends, family, people from the church, they're all looking everywhere they can for the missing 8-year-old girl. They searched for the next 2 or 3 days or so, but they ended up calling off the large-scale search, a couple of days later, but still had people out there searching in smaller amounts. They were at a loss. They looked everywhere. They looked under every rock, every branch, every stick that they could find. They looked in trees. They looked in bushes. They knocked on doors. They looked everywhere, but she just vanished. The town became very solemn, like they all knew something bad must have happened. This was just a gut feeling everyone had, because an 8-year-old girl doesn't just pick up and disappear into thin air. It doesn't happen. It happens to no one. Something happened to her. But the general consensus was not one of hope, but one of just despair. Parents in the area were obviously very concerned. Some kids, I was reading a story, these girls, their parents would cut their girls' hair really, really short to make them look like a boy, so that they weren't taken by whoever did this. Calendar rolls over to September. They still have no sign of Gretchen. It rolls into October. They still have no signs of Gretchen. Some of the families in the area, or most of the families, really are just sort of slowly going back into their normal way of life, while the Harringtons are just at a loss. And then October 14th, 1975 came along. A jogger was, jogging in the Ridley Creek State Park area when they came across what appeared to be a skeleton. Upon closer inspection, they said they noticed fingernails on the hands, and they knew then that this was a person. And so the police were called. They arrived and they confirmed that this was a human body of a very small person. This was the body of a child. And that child still had, clothing on it or near it. And the Harringtons would look at the clothing and they said that's 100%, those are Gretchen's clothes. And that's because Ina, she handmade their clothes. And she knows that those were ones she made. But they would need to scientifically verify it was Gretchen Harrington, and they got dental records. They matched it up. It was, in fact, the body of 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington. Gretchen's cause of death was multiple blunt force traumas, fractures to her skull. Someone had beat her to death. Because her body was pretty much decomposed to almost full skeletal remains, they really couldn't tell if she had been sexually assaulted, but the strong suspicion was that she was. That was probably the driving factor to this entire thing. Once this was basically released to the general public, they would have witnesses come forward. There were multiple people who saw a couple different vehicles in the area where Gretchen would have walked to the school. Some people, there were basically 2 or 3 different vehicles described, and all those people described what looked like a little girl talking to someone in a vehicle. One person described a girl running away from a vehicle. One person described a story of someone, of like a little girl running towards a vehicle. There was just a lot of like bits and pieces, but they couldn't really verify any of it. Eventually, they actually tracked down some of the cars that were described, and they would talk to some of these people, and the police came to the ultimate conclusion that these people had nothing to do with Gretchen's disappearance and murder. Then they looked into all of the known sex offenders in the area, in particular those who have been convicted of child sex-related crimes, and again, they kind of came up with nothing. Because there wasn't really the technology, you know, back then, they didn't really have anything to plug into a system to like match DNA or fingerprints or anything along those lines. They exhausted all of their leads from these tips and these potential eyewitnesses, and just all of it led to nothing at all. And they were at a loss as to who did this to this little girl, why do this to this little girl, what kind of monster is this? And that question would go unanswered for nearly 5 decades. And then, at the end of 2022, the police there in Marple Township, they received a phone call from a woman who said she believes she knows who killed Gretchen Harrington. When the story took place, this woman, whose identity has not been released, she was just a 10-year-old girl, and she lived about 3 miles away from where this all happened. So they schedule an interview with this woman. She comes in, and she said she kept a very detailed diary of her, life back then when she was just, a 10-year-old girl. She also said that she was childhood friends with the daughters of David Zanstra. If you remember, I said his name a little bit earlier. He was the Reverend at Trinity Chapel, where the intended location that Gretchen was supposed to show up to. Well, she spent the night at the Zanstra house, kind of frequently, and she relays a story that she wrote down in her diary that she then tells police all these years later, is that in the middle of the night once, David Zanstra comes into the room and he begins to touch this 10-year-old girl in her private area. She slept over again the following night because she wasn't, she was 10 years old. She wasn't like aware of what was going on. And then it happened again. And so she tells one of David Zanstra's daughters. The daughter responds with, kind of very calmly, "Yeah, that happens sometimes." And then she tells her mom. The mom's like, "You're not staying over there anymore." I don't know what transpired, if anyone went to police with this information. I don't really know. It obviously doesn't sound like it because he never was arrested. Literally a week after this incident took place with the friend at that house is when Gretchen disappeared. So this woman also tells police that she had a friend named Holly who was nearly abducted around the same time. Apparently Holly, I'm not sure if that's her real name or not, but Holly said she was almost abducted twice, actually. And so Holly told this friend, this woman who's relaying all this information now, and she was sworn to secrecy to never tell anyone, so she wrote it down in her diary. These are young kids. They're scared. They don't, you have to understand it's a much different time. I don't know why people didn't go to police and whatnot. It was just a different time. These girls were probably scared. So, but this woman, she writes in her diary that Holly and her think that the person who tried to abduct her was Mr. Z, which she knew as Mr. Zanstra. The interesting thing is that one of the witnesses who came forward back then who said they saw a vehicle near the school that may have been near Gretchen was a vehicle very much similar to the vehicle that David Zanstra drove at the time. What's more bizarre is that David Zanstra was actually interviewed way back then in 1975 because he was the one to actually call and report her missing at the behest of Gretchen's dad. The strange thing is that David Zanstra says he never saw Gretchen that morning at all. Didn't see her. But he gave police a very detailed description of the pair of shorts she was wearing that day. Something that Gretchen's dad hadn't really described to him. So how would he know what kind of shorts she was wearing if he hadn't seen her? And oddly enough, her shorts were the one pair of clothing that weren't found with her. David Zanstra, was questioned and interviewed, like I said, but they never had any evidence or anything like that to really say, oh, he did this. They literally they didn't even know about the stories about him touching, his own daughters or this friend. Didn't know any of that information. All they really knew at that time was that he described a pair of shorts, but he hadn't seen her, and that was kind of weird, but maybe she had worn them before, and he just assumed she was wearing them. Who knows? So David Zanstra goes on to kind of finish his career, right? He's a reverend for many years after that. He eventually retires. He and his family moved to Marietta, Georgia. So, 40 some odd years later, almost 50 years later, when they get this new information, they track him down and they go question him. He again denies having anything to do with it. He says, I didn't see her that day. They ask, well, how did you know about the shorts? He says, I don't know. Then police tell him, well, here's the thing. We have a witness who's come forward to say that you inappropriately touched her when she was a 10-year-old girl. More than once. And she also said that your own daughters said that you do that. And also, we have this information that you may have tried to abduct another girl twice. And now, this old man, because this is 50 years later, by this time now in 2023, he's 83 years old. Once they tell him all this information, he just folds. And he confesses. He right then and there admits to sexually assaulting his daughter, to sexually assaulting his daughter's friend, and then he admits that he saw Gretchen that day in 1975 as he was driving. And he offered her a ride, and she got into his car because he wasn't a stranger. He knew her well. The Harringtons and the Zanstras were close. They were friends, the families. He then says Gretchen became concerned when they weren't driving to the chapel. And he said that she asked, where are we going? And he just kept driving. And they got to a secluded location where he asked her to take off her clothes. The 8-year-old girl refused. I'm not doing it. He got mad. And so he punched her. He punched her several times in her head and fractured her skull. He checked her pulse, and he said he thought she was dead. So he takes her out of the car, throws her into this pile of leaves, and he covers her with a couple of sticks, gets back into his car, goes to the chapel, and then continues his life like nothing ever happened. Police became concerned at this point because this doesn't feel like a one-off type thing. Has David Zanstra done this before, and did he do this again? Marple Township wasn't like the only place he ever lived. He actually moved there from New Jersey. He would move to Plano, Texas. He moved to Georgia. He bounced around. He worked at different religious facilities, churches. He was into contact with many, many children throughout his life as a reverend. And they feel he may, but I can't say for sure, but he may have other victims out there. There have been no other public allegations of any misconduct from him, from all the several churches, but that doesn't mean nothing has happened. So police are actually still asking for the public to come forward that if you knew Reverend David Zanstra during these times that he was a reverend, and you have any suspicions that he may have done something, whether it be abductions, sexual assaults, potentially murder, if you have any information about anything else he may have done, to please come forward to your local police, wherever that may have taken place, so that they can kind of investigate and sort it out. I mean, he was doing this until he was 65 years old. He didn't retire until 2005.
As of right now, at the time of me making this video, it is September 28th, 2023. The arrest was announced in July of 2023, so just a few months ago. He has been charged with murder. They have collected a DNA profile from him. I believe they're still working on taking the evidence from 1975 and trying to pull any potential DNA from it to see if they can confirm any kind of match. But that DNA from him may also link to other cases. It's up in the air as of right now. But David Zanstra was denied bail, and so he is currently sitting and rotting in a prison cell. David Zanstra is a full-fledged monster. He is the boogeyman, if you will, and he had full access to God knows how many children over his entire life, not to mention his own. A man in a position where you're supposed to be able to trust. You're supposed to be able to just hand your kids over to and know nothing is going to happen because this is a man of the cloth, you know? But sadly, this kind of thing happens very often. And God only knows how many people he may have victimized and how many families he may have ruined, and they don't even know it. Gretchen Harrington was 8 years old. She was just walking to church. She trusted this man and got into his car because she knew him. She knew him as Reverend Zanstra. He was friends with his dad. She was friends with their daughters. They knew each other. So he took advantage of that because Gretchen would have never gotten into a car with someone she didn't know and someone she didn't trust. He completely took advantage of that. And because of it, he murdered an innocent 8-year-old child because she wouldn't sexually perform for him. Hopefully, justice will prevail. And hopefully, even though he's 83 years old and is already at the end of his life for the most part, hopefully Gretchen Harrington and her family will finally, after 48 years, finally get the justice she rightfully deserves. But that is it for this case. True crime, a Rooney Dooney Dingleberry Dongs. Hope you found it interesting. Like I said at the beginning, please subscribe here if you're into true crime things and you're a big weirdo like me. Follow me over on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. All of the links are in the link tree in the description of this video below. And I will see you for the next video. Oh, Casey's having a dream. Casey was having a dream. He was doing the running thing. My dog, Casey. Yeah. Oh, hi. Okay, Molly wants to say goodbye. Say bye, Mama. Say bye, Mama. Molly girl. Say bye to the people. Say bye. Don't flip them off. Jesus. That's very rude. They like you, and you just flipped them off. You just gave them the bird. You're evil. Look at this evil face. Look at that evil face. You're going to kill someone one day. I just know it. I just know it. How many murders have you already committed? How many cold cases can we solve right now? Nothing. All right. Okay, bye. This is weird. Bye.